There's a lot of inkers who just go over the guy's lines. If you think back to the people who were inking comics in 1980, you can have your own list of who you would have least liked to ink your work. But there's the guys like Wally Wood. And we give them stuff to ink that's not so hot underneath sometimes. And comes out looking like art, and we can sell it very effectively and very powerfully. And are you going to define the whole class by the best in the class or the worst in the class? And the inkers of today, not everybody still follows the same royalty splits that DC used then, but an awful lot of the industry royalty plans are defined from that. And the inkers have done pretty well off Wally Wood brush.
I'm really glad you shared that with us, Paul. And I wanted to say something, is that just for the record, Marvel Comics is not paying the Wood estate a cent on any Wood reprints, and DC is, okay? Marvel's policy is that once the artist dies, they don't pay anything, okay? I don't like that. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair for anybody. You know, I just want to tip my hat to Paul Levitz for all the good he did while he was at the top of DC, and including toward the end there of us straightening out some paperwork, and the Wood estate is receiving reprint royalties from DC. And I want to thank Paul for all the help he did for all the creative while he was heading up DC.
Not me alone, I assure you, but thank you.
And now Jim's got to get back to the book. So I don't know, maybe you and I could do a couple of answers or questions?
Yeah, I mean,
Jim run back to the booth?
Sure.
Okay. I'll leave you. Thank you so much. Yes.
Couple quick comments and then a question for Paul.
I'm gonna.
Just while you're here, you know, there's a lot been said. Half the panel was on the instantly recognizable aspect of early Wood and his technology, whatever. But I think of Wood as brilliant personally, for the fact that he could just, with a few lines, show beauty in woman, action, the perfect gesture. This transcends all the work that he did from the beginning to the end, except, of course, when he's paid, you know, minus $5 a page in Charlton, you know, or a gold key. You know, occasionally that stuff would suffer or be like, I'm not being paid anything, so I'm giving what they're paying for. Another thing you asked before about who currently is doing some sort of interesting aspect in presentation of technology and the kind of genre material.
Advancing technology. Who is really a futuristic visionary?
But there's a different psychology going on now overall, because things are speeding up in terms of, you know, something that was a gadget 10 years ago is looked at as anachronistic now. I don't think anybody wants to commit to actually depicting technology anymore, because it can change in about 5 years.
Well, Ralph McQuarrie was a turning point.
Right.
For example.
But again, we're talking 50 years ago, or 40 years ago.
An illustration.
I'm just saying now, no one would actually think of making anything too detailed or too obvious, because it would work against itself within a decade.
Well, I don't believe it is that. First of all, detail has nothing to do with it. As you pointed out, simplicity, you know, has, you know, speaks for itself. It covers up. But what we're talking about is conceptual design. One of the guys that I think of as a real futurist visionary is Sid Mead. Mead's work is always on the cutting edge and beyond. So, you know, he'd be a guy that I'd bring up that's working right now, not in comics, but, you know, he's in that field. I have generally found this, that don't hate me for this. You can hate me for a lot of other things, but don't hate me for this one. I have generally found that comics are riddled with real super talent. So there's people who can draw. Real draftsmen, like John Buscema, for example, was the greatest draftsman that we had in the past 30 years. Before him, it was Reed Crandall. Reed Crandall defined the human figure like nobody else ever did. So those are two guys that are really standouts. But in terms of sheer imagination, like we pointed out about Kirby, very few comic artists in the entire history of the forum have real runaway imagination. You know, there are very few Winsor McKays in the comic book business. There are very few, if any, Sid Meads. Every once in a while, Michelangelo or Jack Kirby will come along. But essentially, in terms of real imagination, and in this case that you mentioned, you know, technological, here in comics, anything goes. I mean, if you screw up one month, you get a chance to do it again the next month and you're okay. You know, it's not like you're dropping the H-bomb or something like that. But there's very little real imagination in comics. It's all rubber stamp stuff that has been done over and over and over again. That's been a disappointment to me as somebody who's been in the business for a long time, with very few exceptions, and Kirby is one of those.
I do think, to your point though, Manny, I got to work with Keith Giffen on science fiction stuff for a long stretch. At a point when Keith probably was at the peak of his imaginative powers, but also where we were at the cusp of a set of new technologies. And we were able to do a bunch of things visually totally of Keith's imagination, content of them perhaps some synthesis of what the two of us did, where he leapt ahead in his depiction of technology, but you could see that stuff was coming, but you thought it was coming at a science fiction distance. Now, when you look ahead, it's sort of, yeah, they'll probably be delivering that Thursday. My Google glasses are here, the next version of it, the implantable chip, you know, Niven's Wirehead. Yeah, you know, I can go in for that on Friday. I think my doctor will be ready to do the installation.
The jack in my neck.
Yeah, it's getting scarier that way. A little harder to build the future.
You know, there's one other point I just happened to think while you were saying that, Paul. I don't know when it was, a year or so ago, I was contacted by Lucasfilm to, I forget what the premise was exactly. How has Star Wars changed your life visually? And they, the Lucasfilm people, contacted artists who really had nothing to do with the Star Wars material. I did, but most of them did not. I mean, they're great American illustrators. They questioned, how has Star Wars changed your life? Well, I did an illustration for them, a double-page illustration, that I could not have done 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago because of today's technology. I'm talking about the miracle of Photoshop and, you know, and all that goes with it. So I am thinking that there's a direct correlation, that is a relationship between developing startling new technology and the means by which we have to create it.
I think that's fair.
That's as profound as it's gonna get, folks. Hey, thank you so much for being a
Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Steranko.
So my question for Paul was, during the All-Star Legion,
Justice Society, it's okay.
Society, but I think it was under the
All-Star Comics.
All-Star Comics. How closely, or what kinds of contacts did you have with Wood? I mean, nominally he was only the inker for most of those issues, many of those issues.
Well, Stalker as well.
Okay, but Paul was a writer for this as well, although I don't know how much contact writers generally have with inkers, or they meet occasionally, or...
Well, I mean, normally if you were a writer in comics in the 1970s, the odds of your having any kind of contact with your artist were very minimal.
Depends what sort of clicks.
Well, you might be in a social set of relationships, but half the time your name wasn't put on the script when it was given to the artist.
Right.
Both of the assignments that I got to do that Woody was involved in, were while I was Joe Orlando's assistant in the office. So my contact with Woody, I mean, Stalker comes about, Carmine goes off to one of the annual budget meetings, comes back needing to put a dozen more titles on the schedule, and literally goes from office to office. Joe, you got two sword and sorcery books. That Conan book over at Marvel's doing pretty good. You're 2 months late on one of them, you're 3 months late on the other. Get them going. Joe looks around. I'm sitting there, I'm 17 years old, across the desk. Me sir, please. All right, you got an idea, Paul? You know, go home, come up with something. And I go home, and the next day I'm in pitching Stalker for one of the titles, and I get to have Ditko and Wood drawing my story at 17, which is,
Getting better than that?
you know, it's ridiculous. It should have been illegal. I mean, somebody more competent should have been writing that book. But I got both of them, I'd argue, close to the end of the peak of their powers of doing comics. Not that both of them didn't do some interesting work after that, but that was like the last moment when both of them really had some open-mindedness towards the traditional comic system. This is 1974 we're talking about. And some beautiful work out of them. I've got the cover of one of the issues hanging.
It was, if you don't have Stalker, you don't know Stalker, look it up. There's only 4 issues.
4 issues.
Really nice little gems.
All-Star, Woody had at that point shifted to mostly inking over other people's breakdowns at DC. We had gotten really 2 artists predominantly. Rick Estrada, who's absolutely wonderful man and a brilliant cartoonist. He's a very good, clean storyteller and insanely fast at that point in his career. And Rick was just batting out these rough layouts, and you would look at them and you would think that this was just going to be the broadest cartoon Bigfoot stuff imaginable. And we hand them to Woody, and it came out as serious dramatic comics, which was great. And also Jose Luis Garcia Lopez at the very beginning of his career in American comics, particularly doing a book called Hercules Unbound, which is another beauty that was really an incredible combination. Jose turned out to be one of the truly great artists of our field, and the combination of him and Woody was absolutely gorgeous for the handful of issues they did together. But All-Star, Rick had been laying out in this rough fashion, and Woody was finishing. I don't think Woody was the biggest superhero fan in the world.
I think he was nostalgic. When he thought about superheroes, he thought about Golden Age superheroes. So the All-Star thing kind of worked on that level, and I always kind of assumed Orlando knew that, and he kind of planned it from the beginning. Here's a way to keep Wood's interest in something at DC. He's nostalgic about the Golden Age. We'll have a little Golden Age twist here with the Justice Society.
Could have been good casting in that, but it wasn't his strongest stuff. And after a few issues of that, by the time I was writing it, we were talking about him shifting over to penciling it. And I just remember sitting there with him and Joe in the lunchroom or something, because I just remember, for years I had a napkin, or actually a piece of a tablecloth like this, was just, Woody, what do you want to draw? You know, I'll write whatever you want to draw. And just this little sketch of Superman in a knight's costume. Okay, and I figured out how to do a couple issues that had an excuse to have Superman in a suit of armor. And castles. You know, if that's what you want to draw, fine by me. I'll figure out some way to make it work. That was too busy being honored.
People about his castles and his trees that say, "Oh, I love the way you draw trees." And he said, I love Wally Wood trees. He says, there's no such thing as a Wally Wood tree. Oh, the way you draw trees is beautiful. He says, those are Hal Foster trees. Ready?
I think we have to let...
One quick explanation on comment I made before. If Wood had only done the humor stuff he did for Mad, that would be enough to make him a superstar forever.
Absolutely.
Anyway, he was 2 superstars.
Any number of contributions. Daredevil alone, the stories he did for Vampirella were fabulous. even the Justice Society material, it was late in his career, he was going downhill, but it's living on. The mad stuff, the science fiction stuff.
So what I want to say, we're focused on EC, we're focused on the science fiction, the early stuff, people, we're focused on him not wanting to go to shows because people come up to me, oh, the EC's not good, the EC's good. But the thing that really flipped me, even though I loved Wood already, I'd already, bought Tower Comics when I was 9 or whatever, 8, was one of the first EC stories I saw, even though I was aware of the same artist doing the science fiction stuff, was, I think it's called Came the Dawn?
Yeah.
I forget what it's called. It's,
Yeah, shock
some woman
suspense stories.
knocks on a cabin and he lets her in and he hears a radio that, some psychopath lady has escaped and he takes her outside. The art in that is just I was like,
Yeah.
and there's no science fiction, it's
Well,
just a rustic cabin. It's just
In that series, in
beautiful woman.
shock suspense stories and crime suspense stories, what's interesting about that is these are actually very political issues they're dealing with there. They're dealing with racism, they're dealing with all kinds of things, lynchings, all kinds of things like that. That was very gutsy material for a mainstream, full-color comics publisher to be publishing in the 50s. And most of the people at EC, John Severin would be an exception. John Severin was very right-wing, but most of the people at EC were liberals, and the whole McCarthy thing, before they got dragged into it with the Kefauver and all that, they didn't like it, and they were against it, and they were fighting, racism and any kind of injustice that they saw.
Be fair to Severin, I don't think he was pro-racism or injustice.
No. Yeah, I never meant that.
His preferred solutions may have been different than the liberal
Right.
solutions, but I think John was as sensitized to those issues as any of the
And
rest of them.
as different as their politics were, John and Wood had a foundation, a mutual foundation. They had similar roots when they first come to New York. They met when Wood first came to New York, and he noticed that Wood was wearing his paratrooper pin, and I believe that John had been a paratrooper too. So they had some very interesting long-term connections, but their politics, they go to like New Year's parties or mad parties and things, they'd always end up having political discussions.
I think this is just salient this week with the stuff that's been going back and forth with Chuck Dixon and Paul Levitz argument at the Wall Street Journal. And we've always had a vast majority of the talent in the comic book industry more left-leaning than more right-leaning politically in America, but it's never stopped the guys who are right-wing from getting work.
I would say the audience is predominantly more on the right than it is on the left, though.
We never did market research in my day of the politics of our audience. I don't know, but the talent you knew because you had conversations with them.
All right.
Thank you so much. Wood forever.
Thanks for showing up, guys.